Mr Johnson turns to the case of child D. He says Letby didn't really remember the baby girl, as she had said that in police interview. He says the absence from the paperwork of her involvement would give her plausible deniability. He says, however, thanks to the hard work of the police, they can put her in the room. He says Letby's interview is undermined by the rota diagram, putting her in room 1 on the night shift with child D, and for her searching for the parents' names on Facebook. He says Letby could have got the names from the handover sheets, but the handover sheets do not have the parents' names on them. Mr Johnson says this is similar to child K, when Letby searched for the parents on Facebook 26 months after child K's time on the neonatal unit. Letby could offer no explanation for this, which Mr Johnson says is a lie. Why won't she tell you the truth? Mr Johnson says there is no doubt that child D and her mother suffered suboptimal care at the hospital, but her progress went upward upon her transfer to the neonatal unit. Child D was stable with minimal oxygen support and responding well to treatment. The court had previously heard evidence child D was on CPAP, responsive when handled, and her chest was clear with regular respiratory effort. Her abdomen was soft and non-distended. Mr Johnson turns to the night shift on June 21st, 22nd, 2015. Mr Johnson says June 21st was Father's Day that year. Child D's designated nurse Caroline Oakley also had a designated baby in room 2. Child D was in room 1. Letby's designated baby in room 3 from the child C case was now in room 1, again as Letby's designated baby, along with another baby also in room 1. Child D's observations were all completely normal according to Caroline Oakley, and she was breathing beautifully in air with 100% oxygen saturation, the highest they can be. Mr Johnson says this couldn't be better for a child with pneumonia. Dr Andrew Brunton said the plan for child D was to start receiving milk. Mr Johnson says there were no problems until Caroline Oakley left the room for a break. He cites other cases when this happened of staff members who left and babies collapsed. The alarm went off, and when Catherine Percival Ward arrived, she found Letby in room 1. She said in cross-examination she couldn't be certain. Mr Johnson says, who else could it have been? Who else had children to care for in that room? He says it wasn't any of the other nurses on duty that night. One was looking after babies in room 2, and another was Elizabeth Marshall, a nursery nurse, who said she saw Letby doing chest compressions on child C in room 1. Catherine Percival Ward said the rash on child D was something she had never seen before. In cross-examination, she was accused of adding detail to the skin discoloration description. Mr Johnson says it was in the original recording she had made to police, a quote mosaic, a mottling colour of blotchiness. Caroline Oakley recalled being called back to room 1 by Catherine Percival Ward and Lucy Letby. Mr Johnson had asked Letby in cross-examination why she was writing in child D's chart. Letby said she could not comment if she had been in room 1 throughout. The timing on the neonatal schedule shown to the court says the note was made at the time of child D's collapse. Mr Johnson says an observation reading for child D is timed at 1:15 a.m. on June 22nd, written by Caroline Oakley. Those details were told to her by the girls. Mr Johnson asks who of the girls would have provided those readings. Mr Johnson says Letby did not want the paperwork to attach her to the case of child D, and that was why she minimised her involvement in police interview. A blood gas chart for child D at 1:14 a.m. is not signed. Letby in cross-examination said, "I don't know," when asked if it was in her writing. Letby accepted that elevated 14 on 0114 is in her style of writing. Letby said the lack of a signature was an error, and said the following entry was also unsigned and happens from time to time. Mr Johnson says it's the timing of this absent signature which is the power of circumstantial evidence. Mr. Johnson says Letby gave an IV infusion to child D 5 minutes before the baby collapsed. It was signed for by her and Caroline Oakley. Miss Oakley said she couldn't explain the signature as she was on her break. She described the rash on child D as something she had not seen before in her 20 plus years of working with neonates. She described it as a deep red brown, different from mottling, different to what I had seen before. Dr. Emily Thomas said in agreed evidence that child D came out in a rash which faded after treatment. Mr. Johnson says the description she provided was remarkably similar to that provided by others, but wasn't challenged on it. Dr. Brunton said child D had developed a rash. In his notes, quote, "Nurses noted that became extremely mottled, +++. Also noted to have tracking lesions, dark brown black across trunk." Mr. Johnson says this explains "I don't remember." He says if Letby had remembered child D, she would also have to admit it was either her or somebody else in the room with her that gave this description to Dr. Brunton. Letby had said several times, "I don't remember that being discussed at the time." Mr. Johnson says it was recorded here. Mr. Johnson says the similar descriptions given by the doctors and nurses of the discoloration were because the causes of the collapses were the same. Child D's discoloration had gone by 2:35 a.m. Dr. Brunton noted the skin discoloration reappeared at the second collapse. Mr. Johnson says, "What are the chances?" At 3:45 a.m, child D had a third and fatal collapse. Dr. Thomas said she was with another baby when she was alerted by a nurse with brown hair and believed she was the designated nurse for child D and believed she had also been a designated nurse for child A. Dr. Thomas said Letby had said, "This is my second baby this has happened to," and was upset. Mr. Johnson says even here, Letby was associating what happened to child D with what happened to child A. Dr. Brunton had never seen a baby behave like this prior or since. Dr. Brunton was struck by child D's rapid collapses and recoveries. Mr. Johnson says it tells you child D was sabotaged and Letby was lying when she said she didn't remember. Mr. Johnson says Letby's police interviews were unremarkable, but when asked about babies' deaths in evidence, she replied, "You don't forget things like that, they stay with you." Mr. Johnson says if this is the case, then here we have someone who doesn't remember a baby collapsing on 3 separate occasions and subsequently dying. He asks if Letby was trying to gain sympathy from the jury. Mr. Johnson said that Letby was asked in police interview if the events of child D had upset her. She replied, "I honestly can't remember." Letby said in a message to a colleague on June 22nd, 2015, "Child D collapsed and had full resus. So upsetting for everyone. Parents absolutely distraught. Dad screaming." Mr. Johnson says this was on Father's Day. He says Letby from the text messages did in fact remember child D. Professor Owen Arthur said in evidence the minor infection in child D was improving. He added one of the lines of gas in the post-mortem examination was highly unusual. He said he had similar findings in child A and child O. He said he had never seen so much air in the great vessels. Another medical expert, Dr. Marnarides, had ruled out sepsis and concluded child D was killed by an air embolus. Dr. Sandy Bowen said child D was recovering from pneumonia and the speed of the collapse was very unusual and not indicative of infection. She concluded the cause of the collapse was air embolus. Child D's distress and rash description supported her opinion. She rejected the evidence that taking child D off CPAP caused her death. Dr. Evans viewed the case as one where air embolus was the only viable cause of death. He was cross-examined about the blood gas record for child D. Mr. Johnson says Dr. Bowen had given evidence to say the blood gas record was satisfactory. Mr. Johnson is now turning to the case of child G on 3 counts of attempted murder. Child G was the most premature of all the babies with the lowest birth weight. Mr. Johnson tells the court child G had the grossest misfortune to meet Lucy Letby when she was transferred to the Countess of Chester Hospital. He refers to child G's 100th day of life on September 7th, 2015, when a banner was put up and a cake had been baked to mark the occasion. He says on that day she suffered a severe brain injury which has left her dependent on her parents. Mr. Johnson says all the experts agree child G was in a very satisfactory position prior to her collapse. Mr. Johnson says Letby knew child G's 100th day and the premature baby's due date. Mr. Johnson says Dr. Evans had described child G's vomit on September the 7th was extraordinary, and nurses had described the extent of the vomit was something they had never seen before. He says there are two choices, that child G was sabotaged by being overfed, or having tolerated escalating amounts of milk, she then vomited with unprecedented force due to an infection which no staff had ever seen present itself before or since. Some people may say there is a first time for everything, Mr. Johnson says, but adds this is no naturally occurring event and has been seen in several other babies' cases, including child C, child J, child K and child N. Mr. Johnson says nursing notes showed a normal baby feeding properly in the hours before child G's vomit on September 7th. At 8 p.m. on September 6th, nursing colleagues said child G was stable and well. A staffing rota for the night is shown for September 6th to 7th. This was a quiet night. Child G received a full feed from a bottle at 11 p.m. and was thriving. Mr. Johnson says little babies don't take full feeds from bottles unless they are happy little babies. He says Letby has massaged the times as she had done in several other cases. Mr. Johnson says the prosecution suggests the vomit was at 2:30 a.m, not 2:15. Nursing colleague Elsa Simpson initially said she was with Letby when child G projectile vomited at 2:15 a.m, and if that was true, Letby could not have been the cause of it. In a subsequent interview, she said she didn't know where the other nurses were. Mr. Johnson says Letby's nursing note on September the 7th includes, quote, care given from 0 to 100 to present. Child G had large projectile milky vomit at 2:15. Mr. Johnson says it's an interesting line that Letby had given care from 2 a.m. He says this note is written 6.5 hours later, and the jury should take that with care, especially with Letby, as she habitually misrecorded information. Mr. Johnson says child G wouldn't have tolerated a 45ml milk feed under gravity if the stomach was already containing undigested milk. He says Elsa Simpson's original account does not correspond with the neonatal review, as Elsa Simpson fed a different child in room 1 at 2:20, child G being in room 2. That child was demanding food, Mr. Johnson says, and that takes time. Medication was co-signed for child G at 1:42 by Elsa Simpson and another child at 2:13. Mr. Johnson says all this material shows she was very busy at this time and cannot be accurate with the 2:15 a.m. timing of the event. Dr. Alison Ventress recorded, child G had very large projectile vomit reaching chair next to cot and canopy, called urgently at 2:35 a.m. Mr. Johnson says Dr. Ventress was called urgently as child G suffered a catastrophic brain injury. Mr. Johnson says Elsa Simpson was distracted in room 1, her colleague had gone on a break, and that gave Letby the perfect time to sabotage child G and misrepresent it in the notes. Mr. Johnson says child G was force-fed milk and air injected by using the plunger in the syringe. He says Letby took advantage of taking on child G's care. Dr. Ventress was later called out of theatre to intubate child G and noted blood-stained secretions coming from the vocal cords. Dr. Stephen Breary, asked about child G's desaturations on the ventilator, said, quote, I can't explain that. It's unusual for babies to desaturate on ventilators. The fact that Dr. Ventris was getting chest movement from child G was perplexing, and I cannot think of a natural cause of why that would happen. Mr. Johnson says the truth was it was an unnatural process caused by Lucy Letby. Mr. Johnson asks what would cause child G's throat to bleed, as similar to the cases of child E, child N, child O and child H. He says it was sabotage by Letby. It is a signature of many of her attacks on these babies. After 6 a.m. on September the 7th, 100 ml of air and fluid was aspirated from child G. Mr. Johnson says the only source of that was from Lucy Letby, who caused the baby a devastating brain injury. After that, child G's saturation levels improved and she did not have issues with her stomach. Mr. Johnson says what was vomited and aspirated was nothing to do with infection. Dr. Sandy Bowen remarked that the baby had been very stable prior to the collapse. The pH reading showed child G's stomach was empty and discounted the possibility of there being undigested milk. If there had been an infection, there would have been subtle markers present in observations. She rejected a suggestion by Letby in interview that child G swallowed air when vomiting. Dr. Bowen said child G was extraordinarily premature and an observation of blood-stained secretions was down to the use of a tube on June 14, 2015. Letby in interview remembered her colleague was on a break and would not have left child G alone. Letby suggested the vomit had not left the cot. Mr. Johnson says this is at odds with agreed evidence and the note made at the time by Dr. Ventris. Letby said she had seen child G vomiting. Upon child G's return to the Countess of Chester Hospital, having been transferred to Arrow Park for several days, she had the misfortune, Mr. Johnson says, to be in Letby's care on September the 21st. On September the 21st, Letby was designated nurse for child G and 2 other babies in room 4. Letby said in a nursing note that at 10:15 a.m, child G, quote, produced 2 large milky projectile vomits. Mr. Johnson says child G had been sabotaged again by Letby shortly after recording entirely normal observations. Child G's abdomen was noted to be more distended than usual. Mr. Johnson says Letby misrepresented what the situation was when she texted a nursing colleague that night, saying child G looked rubbish when I took over this morning and she had inherited a problem, which Mr. Johnson says was untrue. Mr. Johnson says if child G did look so bad, she would have referred her to a doctor first before feeding. Mr. Johnson says it's a lie to divert the suspicion. Letby was involved in a text message conversation regarding the message that said, "Looked rubbish this morning." Letby added, quote, "I personally felt it was a big jump considering how sick she was just a week ago. Being in 4 is bad enough, and then having nursery nurses that just don't always know. Mum said she hasn't been herself for a couple of days." Mr. Johnson says it fits Letby's narrative that nursery nurses are bad. He says the false narrative could not be clearer, as Letby also recorded child G's poor condition in nursing notes written retrospectively. Mr. Johnson moves to the second incident on September 21st, 2015 for child G. He says this was when child G was having a cannula inserted behind a screen at about 3:30 p.m. and there were problems with the insertion. Child G was put onto a trolley to carry out the procedure. A nursing colleague said in evidence she had contacted police 1 month prior to say Letby had not switched off the monitor in this event and one of the doctors had apologised to her for not putting the monitor back on. Dr. David Harkness said the monitor was, quote, definitely not turned off and said they were, quote, so keen to get fluids going again for child G as it had been 6 hours since she last had fluids and child G was not just left alone. In cross-examination, it was put to him he had previously said collapses among neonates of child G's age was quite common. He replied that was his experience in Chester, but his experience in other places since had showed that was not the case, and now refuted the suggestion. Mr. Johnson says the nurse was out of the room for child G and Letby was in room 4. The nursing colleague said child G was back in the cot after hearing Lucy Letby shouting for help. Letby had said she moved child G from the trolley to the cot and neo-puffed her. Mr. Johnson said it is not a credible suggestion. Dr. Gibbs had said whatever the position was with the monitor, he would have made sure child G was stable when he left her post-cannulation and would have told someone he had finished with the cannulation. Mr. Johnson says if the nursing colleague wasn't in the room, the other person who would have been contacted would have been Lucy Letby. Mr. Johnson says this is another occasion where Letby had attempted to kill child G. The nursing colleague said she could not remember a conversation about being crossed that child G had been left alone on a trolley with the monitor off, or that a Datix form should be filled in for that event. Dr. Evans said the first September 21st incident was all indicative that child G had been overfed with potentially catastrophic consequences. Dr. Sandy Bowen said it was basic arithmetic. 2 large milky vomits plus 30 mils aspirate meant child G was fed much more than she should have been.